All right, why don't we get started? So thank you very much for joining. So today we're going to talk about super, and we're going to go through a little bit of a end of financial year checklist for everyone. Before we do that, anything you hear today is general advice. I obviously don't know anything about you, so I can't offer personal advice, but of course, we'll have questions. So send through any questions. You can put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and I will try to get to them as we go along and save some time at the end. So we're going to talk about super today, and there's lots of things to cover with super, but we want to start with you. So we've got two different lenses we're going to put on this: pre-retirement and then, of course, post-retirement. And we'll talk a little bit about super funds and some different options you have there. But we're going to start, of course, with you, because that's the most important part of investing, is making sure you come up with an investing plan and, of course, a super fund and super strategy that fits with you. So we'll start off talking a little bit about retirement. And we're not going to spend too much time on goals today. But of course, the first thing you want to do before sitting down to any review of your super, any review of your retirement savings, is figure out, have any of your retirement goals changed? So whether this is something you're doing on an annual basis at every end of financial year, whether it's something you're doing on a calendar year basis and perhaps every 6 months, I want to start with you. Have your goals changed? Are there changes to how much you believe? And we'll talk about how to estimate how much you need for retirement, but how much you believe you need for retirement. And has the timeline of when you want to retire changed? So start there. And once you've gone through that process, whether your goals have changed or not, or whether the timeline that you want to retire has changed or not, we need to assess if you are on track to achieve your retirement goal. We're not going to spend a lot of time on required rate of return or asset allocation. If anyone wants information on that, we've got plenty of webinars in the past, but it's also an important time to go through that check as well. And then, of course, looking at your investment strategy and how much you can potentially save for retirement is a good idea as well. But we're going to focus on this number because I think it's one thing that people do sometimes get confused about, is how to come up with how much you need for retirement, which of course will enable you to figure out if you're on track. And one of the things we see a lot, and is published in a lot of different places, and I took this, of course, from Morningstar figures, is looking at average balances. Because I think because a lot of people don't spend time thinking about what they actually need to retire, of course, we just go back and look at average and say, hey, if we're doing better than average, we must be in good shape. Doing worse than the average, we potentially need to catch up. But the thing about averages, and the thing about these average numbers that do come out and that APRA publishes every year, is that, number one, these age brackets are incredibly large, right? So we do have 9 years. And obviously in a 9-year period, there are, especially in some of the lower balances, there are lots of things that change. But even as you get older, over the course of a smaller time frame, as you get larger balances, those balances can change a lot because of the market. So I just put this up here, but we really don't want to focus on averages here. We want to focus on the retirement that you're trying to design and the retirement dreams that you have. So how do you estimate how much you need for retirement to make this determination if you're on track or not? And then we'll talk about some ways you can get back on track if you don't believe you are. So I'll go through this rather quickly because we do want to spend a lot of this talking about super. But really what we're trying to do with retirement is, of course, we're trying to amass a lump sum of money. And that lump sum of money is supposed to last you for all of your retirement. And you don't know, of course, how long that period is because you don't know when you're going to die. So what we want to do is we want to translate a income replacement rate, because that's something that's fairly easy is maybe the wrong word, but something that's more doable for us to come up with, into this lump sum. Because of course our super balance over time is this lump sum. What we saw on this last page, right? So what does, if you have $213,000, what does that actually translate into in terms of income? And really what we're looking for to get these two numbers to translate that income replacement rate into a safe withdrawal rate or into a lump sum is this safe withdrawal rate. So we will spend a little bit of time on this very quickly, and we can then see if we're actually on track for retirement. All right, so let's talk about this. We're going to do a couple different steps. And as I said, an income replacement rate basically is looking at what are your spending needs in retirement. Now, if you have a ways to go until retirement, of course, this can be a little tricky, but we can still go through this exercise. And what it will allow us to do is course correct. When we're asking that first question is, have things changed in our personal situation and how much we need for retirement? Allow us to think through what those changes are. It's a little bit easier for us to come up with. So very simply, what the income replacement rate refers to is how much of your income, and these of course are people that are still working in the retirement phase, how much of your income do you need to survive? So very simply, as we have in this example, if you need if you make $100,000 a year and you think you need to replace 75% of your income, that of course is the income replacement rate, 75%. It means that you need $75,000 a year in cash and withdrawals kicked off from your super in order to support the lifestyle that you want. And there's a lot of different factors that go into this income replacement rate. You'll see I've used this example of 75% because for most people, that income replacement rate is going to be below 100. Now, that's based on personal circumstances, but very simply, there's a couple different things that change, of course, when you're retired. The first thing is you no longer need to save money, which is obviously a plus because you're generally saving money for retirement and now you are retired. So that is one thing. The other thing is taxes. So more often than not, your taxes will actually reduce in retirement, especially if you, of course, have saved money in super, because there are tax advantages to super, which we want to take advantage of, or which we will take advantage of if we have money in super. And then we've got this lifestyle differences. So your lifestyle differences in retirement, a couple different factors. It could be a little bit cheaper for you because you are not spending as much on some of the things associated with your job. So whether that's travel to and from work, other expenses around your job. But we have to remember that lifestyle differences also could cause you to spend more because, of course, you have more free time. Maybe you want to travel more. Maybe the more free time is just inducing you to spend some more money. So it's important to consider those lifestyle differences as well. All right, so how do we do this? And the last lifestyle difference, I guess I should say, is a lot of people do move during retirement. So potentially you're moving to a cheaper location. So that's something to consider as well. All right, so very simply, I went on paycalculator.com and you can plug in your pay or just look at a pay stub and figure out exactly what you are paying into super, what you are paying into tax. And this allows you to go in there and look at that replacement rate. So very simply, I put it $100,000. And basically what this shows us is when we take away the required savings into super and we look at the tax differences, we get an income replacement rate of around 70%. So in that 75% example, of course, I was accounting for, all right, well, I'm going to spend a little more in retirement now that I have more free time. So this is obviously something anyone can do. It's really starting with, of course, where you are right now. Now, if you do have a longer time period until retirement, you could, of course, assume that hopefully your salary will grow, but your expenses might grow over time. We're obviously all very, very cognizant of inflation right now. And so your spending power of a dollar, or the spending power of a dollar, will, of course, go down over time. So we do want to factor that in as well. But we can very simply put on a assumed inflation rate in your spending if you do have a long time before retirement. So you can do that with any financial calculator. You can do it with our portfolio projection tool simply by putting in how much you make now and then putting in an assumed inflation rate over the time you have until retirement. So that can help you estimate that. And this is really what we're talking about now. So remember, we're talking about, okay, how do we do? And this is an example using our portfolio projection tool, but you can use any sort of financial calculator. One thing that is important to say here is that I guess one of the advantages of a graduated marginal tax rate, meaning that you will be taxed more as you make more money. One of the advantages of that is, of course, as you get paid more taxes come out, and it's a bigger savings in retirement, assuming your tax rate is going to go down pretty significantly in retirement. And yes, you can have access to this tool. I just saw that come through on the chat. You just email me at mark.lamonica1@morningstar.com. I'll send you a link to this tool. Now, remember, if the tax cuts, if those stage 3 tax cuts do come into effect on the 1st of July, 2024, those marginal tax rates get flattened, right? So that's something to consider as well. But anytime you do have a marginal tax rate, just remember that as you make more, you will be paying more. So what we've done now is we've taken a snapshot. We've looked at our income replacement rate. We've thought about, even if we have a long time before retirement, we've thought about some of those different changes that might happen to our lifestyle, what might happen to, obviously, the fact that we are not saving anymore, that our tax rate will come down. We've included inflation in here, so this can just be pure inflation, what you think inflation will be over that time period until retirement, or if you think that you are going to continue to have a lifestyle that costs more above the rate of inflation, perhaps you think you are going to continue to grow your salary, you can put in those assumptions as well. And remember, we're not trying to get an exact number here. And I think one of the reasons that people have problems with especially longer term planning is that they think that, okay, well, if there's not absolute accuracy in these estimates, then they serve no value. But of course they do. You can put ranges on this. You can just make an assumption that can be adjusted over time, but at least you have a starting out point to estimate how much you need in your super. All right, so as I said, lifestyle changes, and here are just some examples. As I talked about before, if you're moving to a location with a higher or lower cost of living, perhaps that's an adjustment you want to make. If potentially there's going to be major changes to your expenses, perhaps if you believe that you'll be able to pay off your mortgage by retirement, that could see a substantial drop in your month-to-month expenses for living costs, spending patterns, as I talked about. In many cases, studies out there have shown that there's actually different spending patterns at different times of retirement, that they often jump initially. You're hopefully still in good health. You have more time on your hands. Maybe you want to travel more. Maybe you are going out to eat more, things of that nature. And then slowly over time, as potentially your health deteriorates, those expenses will go down, and then they often balloon again at the end of life, because there's a lot of end of life care that you need to pay for. The other thing, of course, any of these plans, and depending upon how close you are to retirement, obviously depending upon the asset levels you have, will you have any additional sources of income? And the big one is the age pension. So, of course, if you are in a situation where you qualify for the age pension, that, of course, can lower that income replacement rate even more because, of course, you're getting that income from somewhere else and you don't need your super to pay for that. So think of those other assets you may have that sit outside of super. So that could be everything from just having an investment portfolio in a taxable account. It could potentially be investment properties that you own where you are collecting rent on those, and that is a source of income. So think about all of that. We're really just looking at super right now, but think about that holistic picture of your financial situation and where that is going to impact you. All right, so hopefully we've then come up with And sort of through this example, as we walk through, we've come up with a salary, your quote unquote salary expected in the future. So in this example, and basically what I did with this portfolio projection was I did put in a 5% figure a year over the next 10 years to account for increases in salary, increases in inflation. That gets us to $162,000. So basically our $100,000 salary has become $162,000. So if we go back in, we look at taxes you will pay. So you're paying about $42,000 in taxes. You are saving a certain amount. And what I'm looking at here from a savings perspective is just that mandatory contribution percentage to super at the present rate. But of course, that can change. I've added in some reduced expenses in retirement, accounting for those lifestyle changes. And I've added in this case, okay, we are getting $10,000 a year from the age pension. So what we're looking for then is we're looking for a super balance that can support $91,268 a year, just to be precise and exact, in withdrawals that you want to make from that super. So one thing before, because we always get this question, or I always get this question, is people talk about the mandatory amount that you need to take out of super. Well, we're kind of ignoring that right now. What we're really looking at is your spending needs. Because remember, the government dictating that you need to take a certain amount out of super every year does not mean you need to spend the money. So that money can, of course, come out and sit in a bank account if it's in excess of what you believe is a safe withdrawal rate, which we'll get to in a second, and you believe needs to support your spending costs. So there is nothing wrong with, other than you, of course, losing some of the tax advantages, there's nothing wrong, of course, with taking money out of super if you're forced to by the government and then putting it into a different account where you're able to continue to save that money. So this gives us a replacement rate of 56%. But more importantly, going through this process is not so much that income replacement rate, it's this number right here, because that's what you're going to need in the first year of retirement for your super to kick out that number, because that's what you're going to be spending on the lifestyle that you'd like to live. All right. And then very simply, before we get there, the last step, of course, and we'll talk about withdrawal rates in a second. The last step here is simply a bit of math. And all that is we want to divide this number by our withdrawal rate. So very simply, if you have a 4% withdrawal rate, and we'll get into that in a second when we get into the retirement portion of this. If you believe a 4% withdrawal rate is your safe withdrawal rate, simply divide 91,268, divide that by 0.04, and that's going to kick out that total portfolio number. And that will really allow you to figure out if you are on track for retirement. So once again, if people want more information on how to set goals and figure out your required rate of return, just send me an email and I can send you some webinars and some other articles and podcasts that we've done on this. But really, this is the big step to figuring out if you are on track for super. And what this will allow you to do is then go through all the other pieces of an investment strategy. So what should your asset allocation be? What returns you need to get? All those other parts about goal setting allow you to figure out if you're on track. The first thing you need to do, obviously, to figure out if you're on track is to know where you want to get. So what do you do if you go through this exercise, set up this goal for retirement, and find out you're not on track? Well, there's a couple things we can do. And especially if you are in pre-retirement, this first one, if you have a ways to go until retirement, is you can look at your asset allocation. So very quickly, asset allocation simply refers to asset allocation simply refers, sorry, I just saw a comment from Lisa, which I'll go through those comments in a second, but your asset allocation simply refers to how you are allocating between different asset classes. Different asset classes have higher or lower expected returns. So if you do have a while to go before retirement, remember those returns are long-term and they can bounce around a lot in the short term. If you do have a while to go until retirement, you can adjust that asset allocation. But if you are getting closer to retirement, then that probably isn't going to be good enough for you. Because remember, over the short term, anything can happen. So those asset allocation decisions and allocating more to higher expected return assets like shares versus lower expected return assets like cash aren't going to do you a lot of good if you only have a couple years for retirement, or of course, if you're already in retirement. So one thing you can do simply is delay retirement. Now, this is it's an easy one to do mathematically, right? So if you have longer until retirement, you have longer to save, you have longer, of course, for returns to compound in your portfolio. And mathematically, this will lower that rate of return you need and potentially allow you to get back on track. But of course, delaying retirement is sometimes a choice, if we're lucky, if we can define exactly when we're going to retire, but sometimes it isn't a choice. So if it's either ill health that requires you to retire, it is potentially the company you work for that no longer wants to pay you. This isn't always our choice. So we want to look at a couple other options that we have. And one, of course, is considering increasing your savings. So remember, we've got a couple different levers we can pull here. Higher returns, of course, can get you back on track. Delaying when you want to achieve this goal, in this case, retirement, gets you back on track, but more savings can get you back on track. And you have a couple different options with Super to do this. So number one, there is a concessional cap. The government has decided how much you can actually contribute to Super, and there's some tax consequences if you want to go non-concessional. But remember that your concessional cap right now is $27,500 a year. And you do have this option, if your Super is less than $500,000, is you can actually bring forward, bring back. I don't know how we want to talk about this, but if you have not hit that cap in the previous 5 years, you can use those unsaved dollars to make a larger concessional contribution into retirement. And when we're talking about concessional versus non-concessional, what we'll get, which we'll get to in a second, is really all we're talking about here are tax rates. So as you're probably aware, money that you are saving into Super is taxed at a lower rate than the rest of your salary. And the difference is pretty significant depending upon which marginal tax rate you fall into. So remember, this is kind of the easy one. We can still get that low tax rate going into Super. We're only taxed 15% on the money going in, but it's subject to these concessional caps. So if you go back and look at the previous 5 years, see how much you contributed to Super, that's an opportunity for you to kind of catch up by saving more. So that's one option. The other option is making non-concessional contributions. And remember, a lot of this is tax advice, so it is important to speak to an accountant, spend some time going through some of the specific rules that the government has put out. But if you're under 65 or under 67, or if you're over 67 and you go through and you qualify for the work exemption rules, basically means you are still working. And there's some caveats in there. So once again, this is where you want to go through details. You can make a non-concessional contribution. Now, the advantage, you don't get that tax advantage with the money going in if you're making a non-concessional contribution. But what it does mean is that, of course, once that money is in Super, there will be certain tax advantages. But there are rules, of course, and basically the rules are outlined right here. It's all based on how much you have in your superannuation account. So see the current rules. These do tend to change, of course, over time. But what you can see is you can actually, at one time, bring together this $110,000 limit of non-concessional. You can actually up it all the way up to $330,000 a year if you have less than 1.48 million sitting in your Super. Now, maybe you have $330,000 sitting around, maybe you don't. But this is, of course, an option to try to catch up. And you can see the various levels based on your super balance that you can put through in a non-concessional contribution. But of course, if you are over $1.7 million, you are out of luck. But one thing to think about, particularly if you're younger with this non-concessional cap, if you are able to put more money in the super, of course, you will have lots of tax advantages going forward getting that money into your super. Now, there is a caveat, which we'll get to the end, around this new rule around having $3 million or more in your super. We'll get to that at the end. But still, not a bad option for most people. And even with the tax rules, and there's some controversy around it, and there's some things that people think are particularly not great about this new policy that's coming out. But even if you have over $3 million in your super, tax rate that you are charged is still better than what you're going to get if you just have that money sitting outside of super in most cases. There's a couple caveats that we'll get to. But this is a great opportunity to try to catch up. And one thing I will say, going back to this original chart, which I didn't mention at the beginning, you can see, and we hear about this all the time, you can see there are large differences between the balance that the average man has and the average woman has. And there's lots of reasons for this, and I'm not going to spend the entire time talking about them. But one contributing factor to this, of course, is gaps in work. So particularly child rearing responsibilities, a lot of women are the ones that take that on in a family, and there can be gaps in work. But this is an option, of course, if you are planning on having children or in the midst of having children, it is an option to try to get your balance actually back up. So remember, these concessional and non-concessional contributions to your account can be a mechanism to do that. All right, so this is a little short one. We'll get into some statistics about this, and we'll cover the withdrawal rate. So, what to do if you're actually retired? So, of course, during retirement, there can be changes to your personal circumstances or spending needs. And this is where we want to look at that withdrawal rate. And I'll spend a little bit of time just speaking through what a withdrawal rate is. So the problem that we, of course, have with retirement is we don't know how long it's going to last, because none of us know when we're going to die. The other problem, and I'll call it a problem in quotes here, is that we're all living longer. So that's a very good thing, right? Not a great thing when you're doing financial planning. So remember, a lot of the retirement systems that have been set up and that are slowly changing are really set up around the fact that when they were initially established, people would retire and then die pretty quickly. But of course, lifespans have extended now, and a lot of people need to plan for a retirement period that's potentially just as long as their working life. And the fact that you don't know the end date makes things very, very difficult. And this is where we're dealing with what we call longevity risk. And longevity risk is, once again, a bad thing from a financial standpoint, but can be a very good thing for you. It basically means that you outlive your money because you live a very long time. And there's been a lot of work and talk, and there's a lot of detail in this around figuring out, okay, I have this lump sum of money. When I'm 65 or 67 or whatever year you retire, I have this lump sum of money. How can I make sure that this money lasts? How much can I take out of my super account or any retirement funds that you have? How much can I take out without running out of money? And, this is a problem on both ends. It's a problem certainly with people that have lower super balances, where there just isn't enough money for them to support retirement. And it's also a little bit of a problem, depending upon how you characterize this, that a lot of people are very, very conservative. So they're taking out very little money from their super initially. Obviously, there's those government mandates, but they're spending very little money out of their super because they're worried they're going to run out. And this has a lot to do with their personal circumstances. Do you have children? Do you want to leave them money? There's lots of different factors into this. But what we're trying to come up with is what the financial services industry has been trying to come up with is what is that safe withdrawal rate that allows you to have confidence that you are not going to run out of retirement savings. And really the first person that tackled this was a financial planner in the US by the name of Bill Bengen in the early 90s. And so what he did is he tried to come out with a number that represented this safe withdrawal rate from your portfolio. So I'll go through a couple caveats before we get into some of the work that Morningstar has done here. And what he did to do this is he went back and he looked at portfolios and looked at allocations between shares and bonds, so very high level asset classes, and looked at all the returns. And I think he went back to 1925. He looked at stock returns and bond returns. He looked at only US returns. He's looking at historic data here. But what he did is he ran this simulation called a Monte Carlo simulation, where basically he went through every single possible scenario of returns. So in doing that, he came up with a number that would last most of the time over this historic period for 30 years. So he was assuming that you would be retired in 30 years. And he came up with one of the most famous rules in investing, sort of shorthand rules, 4%. That the safe withdrawal rate for portfolios is 4%. Now, there's a couple things that we need to talk about with this 4%. Number one, what does 4% mean? What does that withdrawal rate mean? Well, every year, what he did is he said that, of course, your withdrawal, your spending needs are not going to stay consistent for 30 years. So you do get to increase that with inflation. So what he's saying is that at your retirement, let's say you had $100,000 in your super, you could take out 4%. And then, so $4,000, and then every year increase that $4,000 by the inflation rate. So this is not a fixed withdrawal rate. It is simply fixed at the day you retire, and then, of course, hoping that that lasts for 30 years. So that's one thing he did. There have been a lot of people that have come up with criticisms around the approach he took. Number one, of course, he looked at historic returns. So what has happened in the past is not necessarily what's going to happen in the future. Now, he looked at a very long time period. He looked at kind of the beginning of the 90s back to 1925. So that's one thing that he did. The other, and he really didn't have any other options, of course, except for looking at historic rates. So that's one thing he did. The other thing that there has been some criticism is the fact that this is a fixed withdrawal rate, and that there is the opportunity, as you see actual returns come into your portfolio, of you adjusting how much you take out. And there's all sorts of methods to do this. I'm not going to go through them all today, but really those are the two kind of criticisms that Bill Bengen got on this 4% rule. But as a rule of thumb, and if you have a very long time till retirement, it's not a bad place to start. And to make yourself a little safer, if you're doing that until you have a long period, if you have a long period till retirement, you could put a range on it, right? You could put a range between 3.5% and 4.5% and look at kind of the range that you need to get your super. So of course, remember, because we're dividing by that percentage, that 3.5% or any lower withdrawal rates will mean you need more money in your super, of course, right? Because in my example of having $100,000, that would only give you 3.5% and only give you $3,500. Of course, any higher withdrawal rates means you need less money to support that spending. And what we did at Morningstar is we decided, okay, well, we're going to try to solve for some of these issues. And we put out this report called the State of Retirement Report. And my colleague Shani wrote a great article on it. And then, of course, I could send the whole report to you too, if you'd like it. So if you want either of those links, just send me an email. But what we tried to do to solve for these problems is, instead of looking at historic returns, and historic returns are very point in time, right? Because they're based on valuation levels. They're based on interest rate levels. Of course, they're based on inflation levels, because we're increasing this by inflation. We instead used what we have at Morningstar is projections from our investment management returns of what we think people will get 30 years in the future for the next 30 years with different asset classes. And what we tried to look at is different portfolios. So Bill Bengen was looking at pretty classic kind of portfolio mix between shares and bonds, where he's really looking at 50-50. So 50% in shares, 50% in bonds. So what we wanted to do is also model out some different scenarios. What if you have more invested in shares? And we wanted to do this because if you went back to the early 90s, of course, you were getting much higher returns on bonds. Now, we did this 2 years ago with lower interest rates, but we update it every year. So when you have very low bond yields, you're going to get lower returns. So one of the charts that was put together is looking at 30 years starting safe withdrawal rates, looking at equity weighting. So remember, everything else in here is bonds. So if we have 10% equity, we have 90% bonds in our portfolio. And we were looking at a 30-year starting safe withdrawal rate by these different asset allocations. And so what we're trying to do here is figure out, okay, if we're looking at different time periods, what are those safe withdrawal rates? So this is potentially something you can use if you're in retirement. And this would be essentially starting over. Remember, this is starting over your safe withdrawal rate. So if you started right when you're 65, you'd be bumping that up. And so what it looks at is different time periods, and we're assuming a 90% success rate here. So I don't know if you think that's good or bad, but basically that means in 90% of the scenarios we ran with the different order of returns that you get, because that is very important in how long your money lasts, 90% of the time, you saw success. So a couple things that we'll look at in this chart to kind of give you an idea of where this makes sense. So, all right, so let's say you only want 10 years, right? So if you think you are approaching the end of your life, perhaps, and you only have 10 years left that your super needs to pay for you, and you have 100% equity allocation, we think you can take out 8.5%. Now, why? And I'll explain it. I'm asking myself a question that I will then answer. All right, so 8.5% if you have 100% of your portfolio in equities. If you have 0%, we think it's 9.4. So of course that's higher. But remember, shares over the long run have higher expected returns than bonds. But over the short run, there can be a lot of volatility. And what we're catching basically by trying to do this 90% success rate is we're looking at, okay, well, 90% of the time, even if shares do terribly over a decade, you're still going to have some money left. And this will give you that 8.5%. Bonds, where there's less variability in those returns, but less longer term returns, you're getting a higher withdrawal rate. And that's just accounting for the fact that you don't have that long for those returns to accrue over 10 years, right? But you can be really impacted by a lot of negative equity returns. So that's really what this chart is looking at. And then, of course, it's going out other time periods. So if we get all the way out to 40 years, what we're looking at is, of course, your withdrawal rate. If you want your portfolio to last longer, it is going to be down. And here's where we're starting to see advantages in equities, right? Advantages in those long-term expected returns that last longer. So really what this chart does is, hopefully, if I've explained it adequately, it gives you an idea of what you're contending with, particularly if you're in retirement, but even if you are just planning on retirement, what you're contending with those differences in between volatility and, of course, longer term expected returns. So that's really what this chart is doing. So let me pause for a second. I see we've got some questions and things in the chat. So I'll spend a couple minutes doing that. Okay, so we've got a question. Will the 4% drawdown be applicable in 10 plus years time though? What if inflation resets and stabilizes at 4 and 5% rather than the historic 2 to 3%? Okay, so let's talk about the different levers here. That's a really, really good question. And one thing I will say right here is, what you can see here. So if we go back and we look at Bill Bengen and his 4% rule, he was looking at 50-50 weighting between equity and bonds, and he was looking at 30 years. So this is 3.8%, it's not 4%. The reason for that is we believe that given valuation levels, that returns going forward will be worse than the returns that Bill Bengen was looking at over his period between 1925 and the early 1990s. So that accounts for that. So let's talk about how these different drivers impact you, because it's applicable to this question. So the question is, what if inflation resets and stabilizes at 4 to 5% rather than 2 to 3%? Okay, when we look at returns, and the way that returns are always, most of the time, I won't say always, most of the time portrayed to us, is they are portrayed without taking inflation into account. So if someone comes up to you and they say, stock market returns 10% a year, and historically it's returned 10% a year. Remember, in that case, we are not looking at inflation. We're not including inflation. We're not looking at real returns. So real returns are returns in excess of inflation. So what happens if inflation gets higher? Well, it means even if returns are the same, those real returns, which matter for you as an investor, those real returns will go down. So if inflation is higher in the future than it is in the past, so if it's 4 to 5% instead of 2 to 3%, that is a bad thing for you. It is a bad thing for investors, all investors. It's a bad thing for retirement and withdrawal rates. So remember, in the 4% rule, we are increasing our spending every year by inflation. So if we're increasing our spending by 4 to 5% instead of 2 to 3%, then you are going to run out of money faster. So what that means is that would push down your withdrawal rate that was safe. So yeah, that hopefully answers your question. But inflation going up is a bad thing. Future returns being higher is a good thing for you. So you can think about those different levers that we can pull in this whole thing. So Rodney says, presumably if you only have assets in super to draw down from in retirement, your effective tax rate may drop towards zero. If you have income from both in super and outside of super investments, and the story is more nuanced, may in fact have a decently high marginal tax rate in retirement if your outside super investments are large. Yeah, it's a really good point. And so this is why tax situations do get very complicated. That yes, if all your money is in super, then we can wipe out all those taxes. If you are drawing on income from outside of super, of course, now all of a sudden you're making money. Depending upon how much money you make, your marginal tax rate could be whatever level you fall into. So yeah, there are a lot of complexities. What we're sort of assuming here, and what we assume back on this slide, Rodney, is, which I'm sure you know, what we're assuming here is that this income replacement rate is only what you need from super. So we could add in other income. So I put age pension in there, but let's say you own a bunch of investment properties and you are making, let's say $50,000 a year from that. Well, the benefit is you're getting $50,000 a year. So that's a really good thing. The downside, as Rodney said, is going to affect your whole tax situation. So you would have to take that into account. So you'd have to take that into account, these provisions for taxes. And you'd have to take that into account, of course, looking at your after-tax income from these other sources. So that is a really, really important point. It just basically just makes this calculation a little bit different. But what we're trying to do is come up with a number that we need from super. So yeah, that's a good comment. So thank you for that, Rodney. A good thing for people to remember. Okay, so we've got a question that says, I'm 75, my wife's 73, totally live off of our self-managed super fund. My wife's mother passed away and we're expecting approximately $68,000. Can I put this into my wife's self-managed super fund? It depends whether she is still working, basically, if she passes those work provisions. So that is a situation where you'll have to look those up, those work exemption provisions that we talked about, and see if you actually qualify for those. So hopefully that answered your question. So ideal asset allocation is somewhere between 80-20 and 60-40, depending upon inflation at the time of retirement. Returns of equities, safe withdrawal rate might be closer to 2%. Okay, so we're going back to this. We're going back to this chart. So depending upon how long. So remember, it really matters how long you have. And this is why sort of the classic financial advice that you get is that as you approach a goal, and in this case, we're not necessarily talking about retirement, we're talking about a lump sum goal. Let's say you're saving for a house. As you approach a goal, you want to be very, very careful about keeping that money invested because anything could happen. If you need $100,000 from a house and you want that in a year or two, well, all of a sudden we've got this little problem, right? That, you, on average, the share market will perform better than keeping it in cash. But what if you have the bad luck that those 2 years, of course, are years where the market goes down a lot? Well, it means you won't achieve your goal. So classically, what we want to do is we approach a goal is we want to up our allocation to potentially go 100% cash for that housing example. We want to up our allocation to less volatile assets because we're trying to limit that volatility or how much our portfolio will drop. Now, the tricky thing with the retirement is, of course, when you hit retirement, it's not like it's over and you just take all your money out, right? You need to keep getting those returns. So it's important to still be aggressive in your portfolio, which is why we're looking at these different allocations. So on this chart, if you're going 30 years, we think the sweet spot is between the 60% in equities and 30% in equities. If not, that number actually drops. You're right that that's what this chart is telling us, that this is sort of the sweet spot from an asset allocation perspective when we're comparing those two things. And now remember, you may sit there and say 60% in equities, like why would you ever do that? Why would you ever think of doing that? But remember, this isn't as clean as just being a 30-year-old with a super fund, right? We would never recommend that you put 60% of your allocation into equities if you're 30 years old and you have that long time period. But the difference between simply saving and investing in an account and retirement is you're taking money out every year. And so the problem you have is, particularly right at the beginning of retirement, problem you have is if there's a lot of volatility, if you have the misfortune of retiring into a bear market, you're still withdrawing money. So basically what you're doing there is you're selling those equities that historically fall the most, you're selling them low. And then if the market keeps going up later, you don't have as much money in your account to make up for that. And so that's really what we're dealing with here. And it's really bad luck at the end of the day, right? If you could pick any time to retire, you would want to retire right before a bull market. So when you're taking out those initial withdrawals, your account keeps going up. And of course, the worst thing you can do is retire and then have a bear market. And it's basically just called sequencing risk. And what that's looking at is when you're taking money out of your account, it's the order of returns that matter, not just the average return over, let's say, 30 years. It's the sequencing or the order of those returns. So market drops a lot, as I said initially. That means you're pulling money out. It means your money is going to last a shorter amount of time. So that's really what we're guarding against with these asset allocation decisions. And what we're trying to do, and of course, none of us know what the future is, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get in a situation where we don't get too conservative, still aggressive because we could have a very long retirement, but we're not too aggressive because then we are subject to that sequencing risk. So yeah, figure out how to retire when the market goes up a lot right after you retire. And if you can figure that out when that is, let me know. Okay, so got a couple of comments. I estimated my retirement needs based on the income PA I want to have. It assumes we'll pay out our property. Yep. So yeah, that's it's really good. Obviously, put in those assumptions, and that assumption, of course, can make trade-offs because housing is obviously, and especially with interest rates and what they've done, housing is a huge expense for a lot of people. So whether that's renting or paying off a mortgage, it's a huge expense. If you can eliminate that expense, that is the best thing you can possibly do, right? So removing expenses is a lot better than, in many cases, having more money. So yeah, it's a really good comment by Dan. See what else we have in this chat. So Lisa estimated. Okay, so Martin says, I estimated required when I was 40 and now 59 and well on track. Is based on want rather than need. I wanted to maintain current lifestyle. Yeah, and I think that's the big thing in going through these exercises and really thinking realistically about that type of retirement you want. So many people, I think, just put blinders on and they go into retirement and they have no idea how much they're going to spend. And all of a sudden their life can be very restricted by the fact that they have a certain amount in their bank accounts, and that's going to dictate their retirement. Yeah. Someone reads first links. I answer the cool tool. Lisa says she needs to die in 4 years' time. Well, I certainly hope you don't die in 4 years' time, Lisa. But yeah, that's the other thing. You can go to Canada. Apparently I won't say that. I have to put a muzzle on myself sometimes. All right. Julie says, if you need to use concessional capital previous year because your concessional contribution did not turn up in your bank account until after 30, does that apply? If you're under $400,000, what paperwork is required? That's a good question, and I will admit I do not know the answer to that. It seems like you had some timing issues there. So, Julie, maybe send me an email, and I can point you to some resources and figure out exactly the answer to that question. All right, so we've got a nice compliment from Graham. Talked about being an Aussie super, and you also talked about bucket approach to retirement. I'd keep to know, sorry, no, I lost it. I'd be keen to know, you and Shine talk about how to incorporate bucket approach into industry super with its pre-mixed do-it-yourself options. Yeah, so just so people know, something that Shawnee and I have talked a lot about on the podcast is we both use Australian super, and we talked about some of the reasons for that. What I would say is, particularly with Shawnee, but we do have a ways to go to retirement. I obviously, as you can tell by my accent, have not lived in Australia forever. So I've been here 8 years. So I've only been paying into super 8 years. I do have other retirement accounts in the US. I would probably switch, and I probably will switch out of Aussie Super into a self-managed super fund when my account balance is high enough to justify the fees. I think Shani wants to do the same thing. She obviously has a lot longer. But let's talk about the real part of this question. So the bucket approach is a approach to retirement that we're proponents of at Morningstar. Really what the bucket approach is trying to do is deal with those issues I was talking about in terms of longevity risk and sequencing risk. And basically what the bucket approach is trying to do is trying to prevent you if you have the misfortune to retire into a down market, is it's trying to prevent you from selling those long-term assets, basically shares, when you don't want to. And when you don't want to is when the market's down. And so the bucket approach advocates keeping a certain amount of money in cash. And depending upon how conservative you are, we're talking about maybe a year if you're pretty aggressive. So a year of your spending needs in cash. That means if the market goes down significantly, you just take those out. And you're using that to fund your lifestyle, hoping the market recovers in a year. And then, of course, the next year you can start selling cash. If you want to be really conservative, you can put multiples of those years into cash. You could have 3 years, you could have 5 years, you could have whatever you want. That means it gives it longer for the market to recover. So that's your cash bucket. And then you have potentially 2 other buckets looking at kind of medium-term assets and long-term assets. And if the market's behaving normally and returns are decent, of course, you can sell off those other buckets and fund that cash bucket as you take money out of your cash bucket. And what Graham is talking about is really what you need to do that in sort of a perfect way is you need to control over those investments. So if you have a self-managed super fund, you of course can do that. You can set up those buckets, and they are, buckets in your mind. It's all sitting in the same self-managed super fund, but you can keep cash in there. You can, of course, have your other buckets. The problem with a lot of the do-it-yourself super funds and these pre-mixed options is that if I want to withdraw money now from my Aussie super fund, they're not just going to take money out of my cash bucket. They are going to sell off a little bit of everything, right? So if they say very simplistically that 80% of your money is in shares and 20% is in cash, and I want to pull $1,000 out, they're going to sell $800 worth of shares and $200 worth of cash and send it out. So it is more difficult to do it. A lot of kind of these industry super funds do have options where you can go in there and look at and actually go in there and be more self-directed in those funds. That's one way you could do it. The other way you could do it, Graham, is you could save, and this can run into some problems, but basically then figure out, are there other ways that you can invest outside of super and have that cash bucket outside of super? Now, there are poor tax consequences to this, right? Because the government, you can't pause taking money out of your super. Government's going to force you to keep taking money out, but you could invest that in shares outside of your super. So basically, you'd be selling out of your super, you'd be taking the money out where you have a cash bucket, reinvesting it in shares. The problem with this is, of course, that you're going to lose that tax advantage. But either way, whether you're in a self-managed super or not, you still need to withdraw the money. So there are ways you can kind of do this bucket approach, although you lose tax advantages. But frankly, you're probably going to have that problem anyway, just with the amounts that the government requires you to take out. All right, so Rodney says, assumed a 30-year retirement, which works fine for most 60-plus-year-old retirements, maybe not so much of the FIRE crowd aiming at retiring at 40. Yeah, it's a really good point that the FIRE crowds that Rodney's referring to, so that's basically his financial independence, retire early. And kind of the premise of this thing is you spend your whole life eating ramen, and then you retire at 35, and you're trying to get this massive savings amount, right? It's not uncommon for real adherents to this. They're saving 50, 60, 70% of their salary, but they're living in a van and eating ramen. So it's figuring out what lifestyle you want. But the problem with this FIRE movement is that they have all taken this 4% withdrawal rate and just said, anytime I get to a point in my life, whether I'm 35 or I'm 65, that withdrawal rate is safe and it'll support my retirement, but none of them bother reading where that withdrawal rate came from. So that's the issue. That was a really good comment. Wow, we're at 2:00 already, which I did not realize that moved so fast. I'm sorry, I missed a lot of the questions. If anyone does have questions, Lisa wants me to DM her about Canada. if anyone does have questions, please just email me. I'm sorry I didn't get to them all. mark.lamonica1@morningstar.com. Sorry, I lost complete track of time with that. I blame Emily for not telling me. But thank you guys for joining. We'll be back. I'll cover some of these other topics next week, since this seems to be something that people are interested in. But anyway, hope you enjoyed the webinar.
This video has been prepared for clients of Morningstar Australasia Proprietary Limited and/or New Zealand wholesale clients of Morningstar Research Limited. Any general advice has been provided without reference to your financial objectives, situation, or needs. You should consider the advice in light of these matters and any relevant product disclosure statement before making any decision to invest. To obtain advice for your own situation, contact a financial advisor.